Morning, and thank you all for inviting me back again this year. It's a pleasure to get out of D.C. every once in a while. Last year, I started off my speech by telling you how fortunate you are to have Chris Nicastro representing you, and you still are, and even more so this year. Chris has been fighting a really good fight on your behalf with the federal government to get your state waiver from Esea approved. It has not been an easy task, but she deserves a lot of praise and credit for that. I was also remiss last year, though, in not mentioning my good friend Mark Van Sant as well, and Chris's entire team. But Mark has served as a federal liaison for all of you, working closely with us on federal policy issues. In fact, Mark and Stephen Burr recently flagged an issue for us which we had missed, which is not only relevant to Missouri, but relevant to states across the country, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But you guys are lucky to have a good staff here in Missouri, and we're fortunate to get to work with them at the federal level. I want to start off with an uplifting note. You can argue, and the Washington Post already has, that the 112th Congress is, in fact, the worst Congress ever. And this is not hyperbole, folks. They'll give you 14 reasons why. I've narrowed it down to what I think is the top 7. The simplest measure of congressional productivity is whether or not they are passing bills that are signed into law. As a matter of fact, we've been tracking the productivity of Congress dating back to the 80th Congress. The 112th Congress, which is quite nearly done right now, is half as productive as the 80th Congress. For those of you who are history buffs, you'll know that the 80th Congress was affectionately dubbed by President Harry S. Truman as the Do-Nothing Congress. I shudder to think what President Truman would call the 112th, given their lack of productivity. They're also extremely unpopular. Even without doing anything, they managed to record the lowest popularity in record in February of this year with a 10% approval rating. They are also polarized to the absolute extreme. There's a calculation that's done in Washington that basically mathematically calculates when the two parties vote together, who in those two parties vote together, and how often they vote together. The 112th Congress is the most polarized Congress since the dawn of Reconstruction. They are also directly responsible for the loss of our credit rating, because basically what Standard & Poor's said was that they couldn't trust Congress to act in the best interests of the American people, to put aside their differences and get something done, so they downgraded us. They're also wasting your time. Regardless of your thoughts on the President's Affordable Care Act, the health care law, the House of Representatives has voted 33 times to repeal that law. I would argue that they could have voted 32 times to repeal that law and then spent another vote on, say, reauthorizing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which would have been a better use of your time. They also have completely failed even when they're bipartisan. The so-called super committee, which was tasked with finding $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction, had equal representation on both parties. A simple majority would have won the day, and they still couldn't get anything done. They couldn't even agree on how often to meet, let alone what the baseline budget figures of their negotiations would be. It's a pretty ugly picture. And I don't know about all of you, but when I think of things that I want the 112th Congress, or the worst Congress ever, to deal with, it's certainly things like Tax-Mageddon, which, as Linda mentioned, is a real threat coming down pretty quickly here. There's a confluence of events that are all going to take place at the exact same time. The Bush tax cuts are going to expire. The payroll tax rate holiday will expire. We will likely approach the debt ceiling limit again, and we saw how that went the first time. And if none of this is taken care of, most directly relevant to us, as Linda mentioned, without further action, on January 2nd, sequestration will go into effect. I'm realizing now that that says 2012 when it should in fact say 2013. But the fact of the matter is, if nothing else is done between now and then, we will have these automatic across-the-board funding cuts. And I want to also be really clear that we have very little time to address this. The lame duck Congress, which is when most people think we'll get to most of these things, is a whopping 6 weeks long, from November 13th to January 1st. given the fact that the previous 10 and a half months haven't seen a lot of congressional productivity, I really don't think that 6-week period of time has the potential to suddenly be revolutionary in the amount of work that they get done. So because I'm not really feeling that confident, I want to spend a little time talking to you all about sequestration and the looming threat of these across-the-board funding cuts. Just in the interest of making this presentation a little interactive, I want to do a little trivia. What is the projected across-the-board percentage cut to all domestic discretionary programs? Is it A, 7.8, B, 8.8, or C, 9.1? And just for fun, let's do a little show of hands. Who thinks it's A, 7.8? Really, nobody. Okay. Who thinks it's B, 8.8? All right, couple hands. Who thinks it's C, 9.1? Okay, good. You're all right, because it's all of the above. Okay? We actually don't know for certain what this cut is going to be, and there have been lots of different projections. The most commonly used number is the 7.8 figure, which was projected by the Congressional Budget Office. And you'd like to think that the Congressional Budget Office should be an authority in this area. I'll tell you, more often they're not. The National Governors Association has projected an 8.8% cut, and the nonpartisan or bipartisan Center on Budget and Policy Priorities has projected a 9.1% cut. But basically, what we're talking about is a range between $3.5 and $4.1 billion of cuts to the Federal Department of Education. Since Linda mentioned that we don't really know how all this is going to play out, let's talk a little bit about how sequestration we think will work if it actually goes into effect. In order to figure out what's actually going to be cut, we have to calculate the total amount of deficit reduction that is needed. The Supercommittee was tasked with finding $1.2 trillion in both cuts and savings. Now, they've made some cuts, they'll make some more, there will be some additional savings. So whatever that number is, subtract it from 1.2 trillion, what we've cut, what we've saved, and take that remainder and divide it evenly among the years that the cuts are supposed to take place. And that's from 2013 to 2021. You take that remainder and you split it evenly between defense programming and non-defense discretionary programming. You take that figure and you subtract any exempt programs. That's a lot of our entitlement spending, and specifically in the case of education, it's federal Pell Grants. And you take that remaining number and you apply it in equal percentage cuts to all domestic discretionary programs. So basically, the reason why, you were all right before is that those estimates vary on the top of that baseline figure, which you don't really know until we've calculated exactly where we are on that 1.2 trillion that we need to find in deficit reduction. If you're confused yet, you're not alone, so is everybody in DC. And I have sat in rooms of people who claim to be experts on sequestration, and they're all like, well, it's going to go like this. No, it's not going to work. No, it's going to look like this. Yeah, okay. So it's a confusing process. Nobody's certain how it's all going to play out. Nobody's certain if it's going to go into effect. But that's pretty much how we think the number is going to be calculated. So where do things stand in terms of this looming threat of sequestration? There will definitely be efforts to either diminish or delay the impact of sequestration. But quite frankly, it's all dependent on whether or not Congress will work together. And as we saw over the last 10 and a half months, that's really not their forte. There's a growing speculation and sense in DC that a grand bargain between the two parties, which would also involve the tax-mageddon issues that we talked before, the extension of the payroll cuts, the tax cuts, et cetera, they don't know what the grand bargain is, quite frankly. The two parties do not know how they come together on this litany of issues. They like to believe that there's a grand bargain. They haven't figured out what it is yet. I spent some time last week with a senior staffer for a senior member of the Republican leadership, and he just said, quite frankly, I don't know what the deal is. We've been trying to figure it out. We've been trying to find it. We're not sure what it is. The Republicans are more likely to want to offset the costs of sequestration rather than delay it. The Democrats are more likely to want to delay it rather than offset it. There's still a tremendous conversation going on around just exempting defense programming, which would, of course, be a worst-case scenario for any domestic discretionary programming, because no matter what is included or not included, You have to hit that $1.2 trillion mark. In the absence of hitting it, sequestration goes into effect. So if you exempt defense, you just have more percentage cuts that need to be made to domestic discretionary programming. There are also, as Linda mentions, a lot of unknowns about implementation of sequestration. Other than figuring out how it's calculated, we don't really know anything beyond that. Now, we've just started getting some initial guidance from the Department of Education. A letter went out from the Department of Education to chief state school officers in which it clarified that the 4 accounts that we get that are advance funded, this is money that is awarded in October for the January, for the following year. That's Title I, Title II, IDEA Part B, and Career and Tech Ed funding. What we now know is that money that is awarded in October will not be cut in January, but will be calculated into the cuts that you will experience in July. So that money will be cut. It's just not going to be cut 3 months after you get it, which, you know, in the grand scheme of things is pretty good. But that's really the first guidance that we've gotten, and there's still a lot of unanswered questions. Most notably, what they didn't say is that the advance funded money for 2013, well, they did answer the question of the advance funded money for 2013. They didn't answer the question of the advance funded money for 2014 or for the years beyond, which is somewhat surprising. If you're going to treat advance funding in 1 year one way, why didn't you say we're going to treat it the same way in the out years? They didn't answer that question. We don't know why. We're obviously going to pay attention to it. And as I mentioned before, Mark and Stephen actually flagged a big issue for us and for every state, which is under current Title I, the 4% set aside in Section 103A, which is school improvement funding, not school improvement grants, but general school improvement funding. Right? There's a little caveat that says if the amount of Title I funds that districts receive the previous year dips below, if you get less than that, then you don't get that 4% reservation for school improvement activities. Well, clearly, under sequestration, we're not going to be able to give every district the same amount of Title I funding they got before if there's a 7.8% across-the-board cut to Title I. So that 4% money, which is the designated money for school improvement activities, is, in our concern, in danger of going away. We've asked for some clarification from the federal government on that specific point, and we're also contemplating some amendment language to an upcoming appropriations bill in order to correct that issue. Because I'll point out that simultaneously, the House of Representatives wants to cut the entire school improvement grant program. So if you lose that 4% set aside for school improvement activities, and the school improvement grant program is cut, that would mean that there's actually no designated federal money for school improvement activities. Little scary, little concerning. The good news is that attention is growing on this issue of sequestration. Chairman Harkin, the chairman of the Labor HHS Education Appropriations Subcommittee, recently held a hearing on the issue, and in part of that hearing released a report which detailed the cuts that sequestration would include, including a sort of a state-by-state breakdown on the topic. Most notably, we're talking about $1.1 billion in cuts to Title I, $900 million in cuts to IDEA. Chris's counterpart from North Carolina, Superintendent of Public Instruction June Atkinson, testified at that hearing and detailed account by account the impact that sequestration would have to North Carolina education programming, North Carolina education reform efforts. We're hoping that that sent a very clear message to the Congress on just how bad sequestration will be. But again, this is attention that is just starting. We're hoping to generate some more, but you know, like I said, we only have 6 weeks really to solve this problem. The House and Senate also both passed what was called the Sequester Transparency Act, and basically this would force the administration to detail exactly how sequestration will be implemented and how they plan to deal with what is estimated for 2013 of $109 billion in spending cuts. The Senate version is a little more specific, and it instructs the administration to give both program, project, and activity level information on the impact of sequestration. Neither of those bills have been signed into law yet, but it's likely that one of them will. I'd love to tell you that the regular appropriations process will fund you guys so much that you don't have to worry about sequestration, but that's also just not going to be the case. As Linda mentioned, we are still expecting more cuts. A little bit of a recap. The president's budget basically flat funded core formula programs while continued investment in his competitive programs, Race to the Top, I-3, Promised Neighborhoods, et cetera. The Senate Appropriations Committee approved a bill roughly at the 2012 fiscal levels and also in adherence to the top line budget figures that were included in the Budget Control Act, this bill that created automatic sequestration. They had some small increases to Title I and IDEA, but then they also maintained the president's priorities. But that bill has gone no further. The House Appropriations Subcommittee just passed their bill a little over a week ago. It cut about $1.1 billion from education, mostly targeting the president's priorities. It cuts Race to the Top, I-3, and the School Improvement Grant Program. It did, however, give a nice big bump to IDA funding, about $500 million. But none of these bills are going any further. They do not have the political wherewithal right now to take these bills from subcommittee to full committee, and let alone from full committee to the congressional floors. And even if they did bring them to the congressional floors, as you can see, the bills are pretty far apart from each other, and so it's unlikely that they'd be able to conference on them. So we're once again, and this is becoming a regular routine in DC, looking at a continuing resolution or some sort of big omnibus spending bill. More likely right now, because it's an election year, we're looking at a continuing resolution, a CR. Right now, the House conservatives have pretty much indicated that they would be willing to cut less money or agree to a higher overall spending limit if the continuing resolution went for 6 months, got us to the other side of the election. It's basically because House Republicans believe that they will have more leverage after the election than they will in a lame duck, because they're expecting that the Senate will flip and become Republican, and there's at least the likelihood that the White House will flip as well. And so if Romney is elected, clearly the Republicans would be smart in pushing a CR past the election. The Democrats, obviously, would favor a lame duck Congress because they think they're going to have more leverage there, because they're also expecting that they will lose control of the Senate and may or may not lose control of the White House. So House Republicans want a 6-month CR to get us past the election. Democrats want a lame duck Congress and a short-term CR so that they deal with the larger issue in lame duck. Clearly, once again, you see their inability to agree on things. Switching topics right now to something slightly more uplifting, and I'll say slightly, because since we last spoke, there's actually been considerable amount of action on the Esea Reauthorization front. Both the House and Senate committees passed Esea Reauthorization bills that address flaws in the current law. Both of them passed bills that shift the pendulum of control back to state and local governments. Both of them, as I mentioned, should be commended on moving the process forward, because to date we hadn't seen any bills on a bill that is well overdue for reauthorization. But sadly, like the appropriations process, neither of these bills are going any further. We'll start with the Senate. The committee approved a bipartisan comprehensive reauthorization bill by a vote of 15-7, with 3 Republicans joining the entire Democratic caucus. Most notably, Senator Alexander from Tennessee, who's a former Secretary of Education, former governor of Tennessee, carries a lot of weight in the Republican Party on education issues. They basically struck a deal to get him to vote for the bill by cutting a requirement in Title II that states would have to have teacher and leader evaluation systems. Senator Alexander is a believer in teacher and leader evaluation systems, but he didn't want the federal government to mandate that. So they cut that from the bill. Alexander decided to vote for it. Ironically, since then, he has publicly been very critical of the bill, saying that he didn't really want to vote for it, but he did just to, move the process forward. But as I mentioned, the process isn't moving forward, and there are really 2 main reasons why. Chairman Harkin, after passing this bill, issued sort of a challenge to the House of Representatives. He said, "Okay, House, I have passed a bipartisan comprehensive reauthorization bill. I'm not moving my bill any further until you do the same." And the House of Representatives said, nah, no, thanks, we'll pass. And we'll talk a little bit about what they did in a second. But the larger issue is also that there was a rumor that the administration, that President Obama, weighed in with Majority Leader Reid on the Senate side and said, we don't want the Harkin-Enzi bipartisan bill to move forward because, quite frankly, our waiver process is going to be tougher on accountability, so let's not give this bill any floor time. We don't really know what sort of was the predominant factor, whether or not it was the Harkin deciding not to move it or whether or not the administration didn't give time. But basically, there's a reason why this bill isn't moving any further. And I want to be clear, don't take my word for it. Take the Senate staff word for it. Because over the last few months, since the Senate has passed this bipartisan committee bill, you've seen massive staff turnover on the Senate committee staff. Chairman Harkin lost his top 3 education staffers. Senator Bingaman lost his lead education staffer. Senator Sanders, Senator Franken, Senator Bennett, Senator Blumenthal all lost their lead education staffers on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, you also saw Senator Burr and Senator Isaacson lose their lead education staffers. These staff people in D.C., they live to work on a reauthorization bill that's passed through the Congress. The fact that you see this much turnover is all the evidence you need that they know the bill wasn't going to go any further. So they left. Turning now to the House, they had lengthy bipartisan negotiations over a long period of time between Chairman Klein and Ranking Member Miller, and those negotiations just completely broke down in late 2011. They just could not come to agreement on differing issues. So Chairman Klein decided to issue sort of separate Title I and Title II ESEA bills, and they both passed the committee on strictly party line partisan votes without any Democrats voting for them. Ranking Member Miller submitted some substitute language. Both of those failed on the basis of party line partisan votes without any Republicans voting for them. And there are 2 main reasons why these bills aren't moving any further. The most notable, sadly, is that there's a belief that these bills do not go far enough in gutting the federal role in education, and so that they would not be tenable on the House floor right now, given the influence of the House conservatives and the Tea Party. But there's also been no real strong leadership push from Speaker Boehner, which we might have expected because the Speaker was heavily involved in passing No Child Left Behind, cares about education, believes in education, knows that NCLB is broken and flawed. We would have thought that with a viable House proposal, he might have weighed in from a leadership standpoint, saying, no, this is something that the Republican Party is going to do. We're going to be the party that reforms federal education law. They couldn't get there, and so neither of these bills are going further either. This is all really sad because in the grand scheme of things, these bills aren't that far apart from each other. There's a lot of commonality in Esea Reauthorization thus far. Across the House and Senate bills, a lot of similarity. Most notably, the issue of high standards has been settled. The House bill does not mandate the adoption of college and career-ready standards like the Common Core, the way the Senate does and the way the administration would want, but it does say that the purpose of a Title I accountability system is to ensure that students graduate college and career ready. Pretty much the same way of doing the same thing. Both bills eliminate AYP as we know it. Both bills maintain the math and English language arts testing requirements, though I will point out that the House bill eliminates the funding authorization for the state assessment funding account, which helps you all pay for these testing requirements. Both sides agree that we have to measure growth. Both sides agree we have to maintain the 1%, the so-called 1% rule for alternative assessments, though we do not yet have agreement on the so-called 2% rule of the modified assessments. Both sides agree we have to have a requirement of English language proficiency standards and testing. Both sides agree we have to continue data disaggregation. Both sides have a school improvement system requirement, though they differ on the prescription that is applied to the interventions of those school improvement systems. None of the proposals maintain the current structure of SES and public school choice, though the House proposal does have a smaller 3% set aside for similar activities. And both sides are trying to increase the ability you all have to transfer funds between accounts so that you can better target the limited federal funding that you get. That being said, there are some dramatic differences between the two. most notably is this issue of teacher and leader evaluation systems, which I mentioned before. It was the key decision that got Senator Alexander to vote for the Senate Help Bill, was a removal of the requirement that in the Senate bill that states would have to have a teacher and leader evaluation system in order to get their Title II funds. Instead, they basically made it competitive funding. There's some competitive grant programs that you can apply for. If you applied for them under the Senate bill, you would have to have a teacher and leader evaluation system. The House went much further on this issue, mandating teacher and leader evaluation systems and mandating that the data collected from those systems would, quote, govern employment decisions. They didn't specify what that meant, but obviously what they were trying to get at is the use of teacher and leader evaluation systems in hiring, firing, and tenure. In the House bill, they completely eliminate the concept of highly qualified teachers, that requirement that teachers have to be highly qualified. The Senate retained that. And quite frankly, they might have gotten rid of it if they had kept the teacher and leader evaluation system, but in the absence of that, you still have HQT. In the House side, in terms of school improvement models, states have complete discretion on how they turn around their low-performing schools, the intervention strategies that they use. The Senate prescribes specific models for the bottom 5%, much like the current school improvement grant program and much like the administration waiver request. The major difference being that the Senate bill also added by amendment a state option model, which would be submitted to the Secretary for approval. But basically, if the state had another way of doing school turnaround, they could submit it to the Secretary and say, well, we don't want to do the 4 models, we want to do this, and it could or could not be approved by the Secretary. Another major difference, obviously, is the commitment to the President's priorities. The House eliminates Race to the Top, I-3, school improvement grants. The Senate codifies them and makes them permanent parts of the law instead of just existing grant programs out of the Recovery Act. The House eliminates probably most of our favorite provision, the maintenance of effort provision. The Senate retains it. And then on this issue of consolidation of programs, the House basically takes 80 programs that exist right now across the law, turns them into 2 large block grants, and the Senate did a slightly more limited strategic consolidation, taking about 80 programs and knocking that down to about 40, 45. So you can see clear differences between the bill. The differences and the political environment is why we have ESEA waivers. And this is going to be most likely where we are for the next couple years, as people are not predicting that we're going to get to Esea Reauthorization immediately after the election. But as it stands right now, 32 states and D.C. have been granted an ESEA waiver, including the great state of Missouri, as I pointed out before. This means more than half the states right now are not under the core tenets of NCLB, AYP, the 2014 deadline, SES. Additionally, 7 states can freeze their annual measurable objectives for an additional year. They committed to apply for a waiver at the end of that year, but basically they're not really operating under NCLB either. There are only 5 states with outstanding waiver requests, and we have 13 states that have not yet requested a waiver. In case anybody is doing the math, we do not have 57 states in the union. We have 50. Those 13 states that have not yet requested a waiver overlap. Some of them overlap with the states that have been granted an AMO freeze, a freeze on their annual measurable objectives. But again, those states that have asked for that AMO freeze have committed to apply for an ESEA waiver. But basically, because we have 33 states, including 32 states and the district under waivers, we're now shifting already into monitoring and implementation of those waivers. This could, quite frankly, be a heavy lift on all of you, and I want to be clear about that. The department has basically made promises to the civil rights community and the reform community, lobbying organizations and whatnot in D.C., that they're going to hold states to the feet to the fire here on what they've promised to do in their waiver applications. We're expecting that the administration is going to start what they call technical assistance, what we call monitoring, this year. Before the end of this year, they're going to start calling the states, and they're going to say, where are you on your implementation? Have you started? What are the tension points? What are the problems? And we expect that they're going to start doing site visits, probably periodic site visits next year. There's some rumor and speculation that those site visits might be every 3 months, which would be extreme to say the least. We're hoping that's not the direction the administration is going, but clearly we're gonna watch them on that, because the more time that they take monitoring the implementation, the less time you have to actually work on implementation, which is sort of not a good idea. A couple highlights just worth mentioning from waivers across the states. The use of what we call consolidated or super subgroups are actually capturing more schools and more students than ever before in these accountability systems. States are employing new triggers and new safeguards to ensure that subgroups that aren't hitting their targets receive targeted, rigorous interventions. States have really committed to using the data that they collect from subgroup performance to help guide the supports and interventions that they're specifically targeting to these subgroups. And what we're really talking about in all of these waiver applications is more nuanced accountability systems based in part on multiple measures of data that are really going to paint a more accurate picture of school performance. As we all know, NCLB was really flawed in this area. The waiver applications that are coming from across the states are so much better in this regard. We're really excited to see them all play out, to see how they can better paint that picture of school performance. It is worth mentioning that the waiver process does have sort of political implications. There is an argument that the existence of waivers took the wind out of the sail on reauthorization, and I would argue one step further, weakens the role that education will play in this election cycle. There are basically 16 states that could be considered battleground states in this election. The Democrats will tell you it's really only 7 of them. The Republicans will tell you it's really only 5 of them. But in total, there are 16 battleground states. 13 of those states, marked by gold here, have been granted an ESEA waiver. A 14th state, Iowa, marked in green, has been granted an AMO freeze, which really leaves us only 2 states that could exert any leverage or help raise the specter of Esea Reauthorization or education more generally in this election cycle. New Hampshire, and they're, I think, whopping 4 electoral votes, will likely apply for a waiver in September. They've had some behind-the-scenes conversations with the department. They're likely going to be, applying in September. And then Nevada has already applied. They're in the negotiation process. They're likely going to be approved soon. I want to be clear that I don't fault any state for going for a waiver, and y'all should be commended for the waiver that you put forward and got. But without that pressure of the 2014 deadline, SES, school choice, all of that stuff, we're not going to see a lot of talk from the candidates, at least nationally, on this issue of Esea reauthorization. There's actually a further reason why, which we'll get to shortly. But real quickly, I want to talk about what else is on the horizon in terms of federal policy. We are expecting soon an announcement on a Race to the Top district competition. This is $400 million to be awarded to school districts or consortia of school districts. They have to be at least 2,500 students with at least 40% of the students eligible for free and reduced price lunch. There are specific tracks for districts applying in rural and non-rural districts, and districts applying within states that have or have not won Race to the Top. Though I want to be clear, despite our request, there's no guarantee that they will fund applications from each of these separate tracks. We've been pushing them really hard on the rural issue because, quite frankly, rural states and rural districts have been shut out of every other competitive grant competition in the administration thus far. We wanted them to guarantee that rural districts would be funded. They basically said, well, we'll fund the best applications, but we'll create a separate track for them to apply to increase their chances. This program will focus, asks the applicants to focus on providing individualized, personalized classroom instruction, a very, very lofty goal. We are excited to see some of the applications in that regard. We do expect the final application to be out soon, but likely with an October deadline, so a quick turnaround for anybody who's interested. We're expecting an announcement fairly soon on district waivers. Basically, post the September 6th deadline, the administration, for the next round of state waiver applications, the administration has said that they're going to invite waiver applications from ESEA from individual school districts. What we now believe to be the case is that will only be open to districts and states that have not yet applied for a waiver. So it's not really relevant to the people in this room because y'all got yours, and it's a good one. That didn't work. Let's try that again. Okay, I can't get to the next slide. Can we advance it in the back? Can we advance it on the keyboard? Nope. Nope. That didn't work. And now I'm just pressing buttons. Well, okay. I don't need the slide. Now it went too far. Also on the horizon, we're expecting a rulemaking out soon from the federal government on their plans to reform teacher prep and teacher prep academies. This relates to the HEA Teacher Quality Partnership Grants and the TEACH grants. They had what was called a negotiated rulemaking, which is when they bring the relevant parties together and try and agree on the rule that they're going to put in place. That negotiated rulemaking failed dramatically. The administration will release their own plans for reforming teacher prep shortly. We expect that they're going to try and leverage these federal grant funds to require the implementation of quality rating systems that would basically track graduates from these teacher prep programs in terms of their employment, their retention, whether or not they're granted tenure, and possibly the student outcomes related to those teachers. This is a hot button issue if you're involved at all in teacher prep issues, and we do expect that this rulemaking will come out shortly. And then lastly, a lot of talk that since they can't do anything big like ESEA or IDEA, that they might try and tackle a reauthorization for the Child Care Development Block Grant. They've actually held a three-part congressional hearing series in the Senate over the last few months. This is actually more overdue for reauthorization than ESEA, and it was last reauthorized in 1996. And the primary issue is this belief that they want to increase program quality, but they do not want to decrease the available slots in child care programs. That is a tough nut to crack, to be sure, but one that they are reportedly interested in taking on. It's also worth mentioning, though I did not include a slide on this, that the administration also released a blueprint for their plans to reauthorize the Perkins Act, or Career and Tech Ed funding. Their blueprint did not garner much attention at all from the larger community, so we don't really expect anything will happen on that front. Real quickly, I'd be just remiss in my job if I came here from DC and didn't talk a little bit more about the election and why I think education is not going to play a large issue. But I want to use as this a recent College Board survey of swing states, or voters in swing states. Large majorities of swing state voters will tell you that they believe education is an important issue and that they believe education is critical to increasing our global competitiveness. In fact, when asked quite simply, is this issue important to me in this election for the president and Congress, education hit the top three, just behind jobs in the economy and government spending. 67% of respondents said this issue is very important to me. And really interesting is that it's tied with healthcare at 67%. You see a lot more attention on healthcare, obviously, but education is on par among swing state voters on that issue. When you look further at the breakdown, what's most notable is this last category here of independent women. 70% of independent women say that this issue is extremely important to them. That is the target audience of this general election cycle, independents and female voters. And 70% of them say this is an important issue. But the problem is that there is a remarkable difference when you talk about the preference for federal government involvement in education. Only 37% of independent voters believe the federal government should do more on education, where a whopping 57% say the federal government is too involved. This is why I do not think this issue will play largely on the national scale, because it does not address that key demographic of independent voters. But a lot of this is up to you, and that's because the August recess is coming up. And if the governor can stand in front of a town hall room and hear from his constituents, so can all of your elected officials. And they will be back here in August. And I encourage you to go to the town halls, meet with them, get in their face on sequestration, on appropriations, on Esea Reauthorization. And I encourage you not to accept the DC answer to your questions. You'll probably ask, what are you doing on sequestration? And they'll probably say, well, I did this. but it didn't matter because the other side wouldn't agree. That's not an acceptable answer. They owe you more than what they have done. They owe you what they are going to do to solve these problems. And I encourage you to push them on these issues and ask for their help and their support, because these issues are too important to let slide. And I guess that's been your federal policy uplifting briefing. And thank you all for having me again, and I hope this was helpful.